depending on where you are. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, different time zones. This is the second of these sessions. We ran one yesterday for sort of the European time zones and African time zones. So it's great to have this opportunity to speak with all of you. My name's Nicole Biskey. I'm the head of the Accountable Mining Program for Transparency International, based in Australia. And as such, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which any and all of you may be. So thanks again so much for joining this launch. We're super excited to be launching this research specifically focused on corruption risk in mining, licensing and permitting in the pandemic era. I'd also like to acknowledge the funding that the program receives. We receive funding from the Australian government through DFAT and from the BHP Foundation. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank both of our main donors to the program for this work and enabling this work to happen. So this research is really very interesting. We haven't seen anything else like it to date. So we're really excited to be able to make this contribution to the field, and really thrilled that there's so much interest and that we're able to get it out there for discussion. So if people are comfortable, and I know it's early or late depending on where you are, but if you're comfortable in turning your camera on, that would be great, because it's much nicer than talking to black boxes. But I know the time zone's not always friendly for turning on cameras, but I just put that out there for you to consider. So firstly, what we're going to do is I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on the Accountable Mining Program, because I know some of you are quite familiar, but some of you are much less familiar. So I'll just give a little bit of background so that you understand the program and why we did this research. And then Dr. Tim Grice, who is the author of the report from Square Circle, and I will discuss the report, and we'll share some key highlights and messages as part of that discussion. And then we'll have the opportunity to address any questions that you may have. So please do feel free throughout to post questions in the chat. But also, if there's something you just want to know more about, just tip a little note into the chat and say, can we hear a bit more about something? Because the report is big, it covers a lot of ground, and it's basically impossible for us to do justice to it in what's effectively a pretty short conversation. So if there are things that you do want to know more about, please do just say, can you talk a bit more about X? So just to start, in terms of giving you some information about the Accountable Mining Program of Transparency International. So as I said, I know many of you are very familiar with the program, some of you even from the program in different countries. But the Accountable Mining Program is the global centre of expertise for Transparency International on mining. So we're based in Australia, but we are the global program for the movement of Transparency International. And we work with Transparency International offices around the world in over 20 countries, in resource-rich countries that are both developed and developing economies. And the countries are extremely diverse. So Zimbabwe, Mongolia, Canada, Australia, Kyrgyzstan, Madagascar, just to give you a sense of some of the different countries that are involved. In terms of the work of the program, we focus specifically on the very first part of the value chain. So looking at corruption risks in licensing, approvals and contracting at that very first point of the value chain. Why do we do that? Well, we have seen research from the OECD that the extractive sector is the sector most prone to bribery. And further, 1 in 4 cases in the extractive section relate to corruption in licensing. So from our perspective, there is a significant issue that needs to be addressed at that licensing and permitting stage. And if we can address corruption there, it will also have a significant impact on corruption throughout the value chain. We also know at that early stage of the process, there are frequent touch points with government and with communities and very high business stakes. And so the incentives for corruption, the possibility for corruption is much higher. So just in terms of some terminology issues, many of you know what Transparency International's definition of corruption is, but it is quite broad. So the abuse of entrusted power for personal gain is the definition used. We also do talk about for political gain. And that's the basis of the work that we do and also of this research and the focus that's been taken. And the other thing to mention is in terms of terminology, so the report talks about licensing and permitting in different countries, in different contexts. The land rights that are given for mining are given different names. So in your country, they might be called leases or titles or tenements or concessions. We've used licensing and permitting, but it covers the range of those sorts of activities. So in terms of our program, as you may know, we have our foundational tool, which is called the Mining Awards Corruption Risk Assessment Tool. And we'll put a link to that in the chat, the MACRA tool. That's our foundational research tool that all of our country officers use to do research and identify what the what the corruption risks are in their context. So they're able to map out the system, and they do this in a multi-stakeholder approach, working with government, with industry, with civil society, and with communities to really identify across the system at that licensing point, where are there weaknesses, where are there some corruption vulnerabilities. And sadly, perhaps, the tool identifies 83 common corruption risks that can occur in different country contexts. And you can imagine in different countries, different issues are identified. And our chapters, our country officers then work on those different issues to affect change in terms of the priority risks that they've identified in their context. So we've been running this program for 5 years now, which is a good chunk of time to really do that solid research and to affect some change and have some impact. We're in the process now of looking at our strategy for the next 5 years, and we've been doing some really focused work on figuring out what it is that we want to try and achieve in that period of time. And we've identified a number of work streams within the future focus that we want to have, many of which align with the report that we're going to discuss today. Interestingly, perhaps one of the work streams is focused on the corruption risks in energy transition, which I know is an area of significant interest for people, but also on environmental social impact assessments, community and civil society participation, and other issues, including business integrity. Across all of these themes, we want to integrate two areas of focus. We have a real focus in the program on gender, and many of you have heard about our gender work already, but also COVID, of course. It's the issue of our time. It's the challenge that is being faced across industry and across the sector now. And it's something that's essential for us to really effectively and properly integrate into our considerations for the work that we're doing, hence the reason that we commissioned this research. So this research for us is a significant contribution to the field, but also a great way for us to dive very deeply into the implications of COVID on corruption risks in the approvals process and to integrate that into our research. So I'm going to, firstly, just to see if everybody's awake. It's early morning in Australia, so hence that. Just do a quick poll, just to see what you think in relation to, from your perspective, have corruption risks in mining licensing and permitting increased, decreased, or stayed the same during COVID? So just go with your first thought and see, just interesting for us to see what people think before Tim and I launch into the discussion. Well, there we go. There's a bit of movement going on, Tim, but it seems majority of people think it's increased, but interestingly, some people are also thinking that it stayed the same or decreased even. So I'm going to close that. Interesting just to get your views before I cut to the chase, in fact, and ask Tim the headline question, which we'll answer based on the research that we've done. So the report itself, just so that you know, draws on over 80 stakeholder interviews, desktop review and case studies in 4 countries, in Mexico, Indonesia, Zambia, and Canada. And just to pause and acknowledge, we've actually got, I think, 3 of the researchers on this call, Laura from Mexico, Trevor from Zambia, and Rob from Canada. So thanks for joining. It's great to have you here, and thanks for the work that you did. So the first question, Tim, to start with is, has the changed landscape of the pandemic heightened corruption risk in mining permitting, licensing and approvals?
Thanks, Nicole. It's good to see we're doing science already on this call. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, evening. Great to have you here. The short answer is yes. The research bears out that corruption risk in mining licensing and permitting has heightened. And I'll go a step further. The pandemic has also shifted mineral governance landscapes. So beyond corruption risk itself, there's a broader shift that's taking place in mineral governance in the mining sector. And that's kind of not surprising when you think about the ways in which the pandemic has changed the way that we govern in many countries. But the important point is that the changes are happening in different ways in different mining jurisdictions. So in your country, there may or may not be some of the trends that we will cover in this report. But in many countries there are. So yes, corruption risk has heightened, although in different ways in different mining jurisdictions, just like the pandemic itself has unfolded in different countries, in different ways in different countries. So yeah, my vote is for yes, Nicole. But we welcome contrasting and divergent views.
Thanks, Tim. And as people will see, and we'll put the link up a bit later to the report, but it is on our website already. But as you'll see, as I mentioned, there's over 80 stakeholder interviews. So there were very diverse views within the course of the interviews, and that's reflected across the report from industry, from government, from civil society. It's great to have that breadth of view, I think, captured. So we'll get into the specifics of the report in a minute, but first we thought it would be interesting just to get Tim to set the context a little bit. So the context of the response to COVID from the mining sector, Tim.
Thanks, Nicole. It's an interesting context, and I'm sure many of us have been observing the way in which the mining sector has been a part of the pandemic response story in many countries, the pandemic economic recovery. And really, there are two stories when you think about how the sector has played a role. The first is the mining sector itself, and the second is the countries in which mining takes place. And they're connected stories, but they're also very different stories. The mining sector, if you cast your mind back to early on in the pandemic, around February and March, we saw a contraction in supply and demand. And it was a simultaneous contraction and quite a dramatic contraction, quite a historic contraction. Of course, mining supply side saw a disruption to movement, to moving employees, to moving contractors, critical supplies and equipment. And on the demand side, there was an interruption to consumer demand, to commercial activity and trade, just like many industries. Industrial construction also slowed and halted in many countries. And so, as you probably observed, commodity minerals, metals markets took a dive. They took a dive for a couple of months in February, March, April. But there was a rally. Markets rallied, companies rallied, and governments rallied. Governments, for their part, as we know, in many countries, prioritized mining or made mining an essential industry. Companies responded throughout those disruptions, and generally speaking, and there's been critiques of this, which we briefly cover in the report and have been covered elsewhere. Companies kept operations afloat for the most part, and markets recovered. And the recovery was a V-shaped recovery, where the recovery actually exceeded, for most metals and minerals prices, and for most large mining companies, the recovery exceeded pre-pandemic levels. So that's kind of the quick story for the sector. You could call this the making of the mining sector as an essential industry, kind of an interesting concept that came out of COVID times, what's an essential industry and what's not. But there's another story, and that's the story of the countries in which mining takes place. And we know this story as well. And for many countries, it's not so good, of course. The public health situation we are all extremely familiar with. The economic crisis that comes along with the public health crisis. There's estimates that up to 150 million people will be pushed into extreme poverty. Economies may take years to recover to their pre-pandemic levels. So how do we bring these two stories together? Well, the mining sector can certainly support the economic recovery as it has been in many sectors, but we also ask whether these connected but in many ways divergent stories create a perfect storm for anti-corruption efforts and mineral governance efforts in mineral-rich countries. And here we're hearkening to NRGI's Daniel Kaufman's earlier commentary on whether COVID is bringing about the conditions of a perfect storm. Whether the storm is perfect, I'm not sure, but we do make the claim in our report that mineral governance landscapes have changed and corruption risk has heightened. So the context of the sector, Nicole, points us in the direction of needing to unpack the complexity of the changes that are taking place.
Thanks, Jim. So in the report itself, the report identifies 7 themes that characterise the change landscape. And I'm just going to share with you so that you can all see. We're not going to talk through every one of the themes. As I mentioned, there's a lot in the report. But this captures in sort of an infographic form those 7 themes. So these are the areas that characterise the change landscape for the corruption risk in the approvals process. So there are issues that cut across various themes. And one of those issues is the economic pressure that various actors are under. So Tim, can you talk a bit about how those economic pressures are creating increased corruption risk?
We might share a story from Zambia on this one, Nicole, which brings a few themes together. And some of you may be familiar with the Zambian government's acquisition of the Mopani copper mines in the copper belt in northern Zambia. You may also know that the industry itself was nationalized previously in the 70s, but then privatized. Zambia is also facing significant sovereign debt. And in fact, there was a debt default late last year in November. So within that context, and of course, the economic pressure from COVID is compounding the economic challenges in Zambia. The owner and operator of Mopani Mines earlier in the year did a strategic review where they cited the COVID-19 pandemic as a significant factor that would mean that they would be putting their operations into care and maintenance. So within the pandemic, economic pressures, a mining company doing a strategic review and making the decision to put a company into care and maintenance, an operation into care and maintenance. That sparked a dispute and a negotiation that's continued through to early this year and ended in the Zambian government acquiring the mine. So prevailing or pre-existing economic conditions compounded by COVID-19, acknowledged by the mining company, which resulted in a transaction where greater state participation was taken in a copper mine. One relatively simple example, many factors involved, but entangled within the economic challenges of COVID. There's 3 themes within the report that speak to economic challenges very directly. They are markets and supply chains reconfiguring, cutting red and green tape to expedite the economic recovery, to approve new mining projects and upgrades of existing projects, and opening up land and relaxing licensing conditions. Just unpacking those very briefly here. Markets reconfiguring, like in the Zambia example, there's a lot in this. One trend that we're seeing is that mining deals have dipped significantly during COVID. That is transactions, M&As, for instance. They've dropped by 18 billion US in the first half of last year compared to 2019. We're expecting to see a spring back as economic uncertainty diminishes and as travel for due diligence and deals are possible. And so a question is what contract transparency measures are needed to scrutinize mining deals and a potential run of mining deals in pandemic conditions. Another interesting one is the global energy transition. And there's different views on whether COVID has accelerated the green transition or whether it has depressed the green transition. Maybe we'll unpack this in our questions. But to the extent that it has quickened the transition, of course, there's different minerals and supply chains involved, and some of the so-called energy minerals like lithium and cobalt, for instance, don't have as much transparency in the supply chains as some other minerals such as gold and such as tin. So potentially a change in the transition or the global energy transition. Another interesting one with supply chains is that, of course, the pandemic has impacted supply chains, which is causing a rethink, we were told by many mining companies, of single country dependence for critical supplies. So there's a desire for diversification in global supply chains, and also localization. It's a good time to go local when you can't ship or shipments are significantly delayed, and flights as well for critical supplies. So there's potentially a reconfiguration of supply chains that is happening due to pandemic conditions. As supply chains reconfigure, this means different actors, this means different transactions, this means different networks, all of which are a part of the system which contributes to corruption. So that's mining capital and supply chains reconfiguring. There's a couple more there. Cutting red and green tape, red tape, this perception that bureaucratic approval procedures are unnecessary and slow, and green tape, the perception that environmental safeguarding measures are restrictive, and so cutting those kinds of tape to fast track or expedite mining approvals. And we see this in Australia, in Chile, in Indonesia, South Africa, Canada, Peru, to different degrees and with different policies. A question around corruption risk in mining licensing and permitting is, with political pressure to expedite mining assessments and approvals, do we have the same standards for due diligence on mining companies, for instance, which are already lacking in many countries? Do we have the same scrutiny of EIAs, for instance? So cutting red and green tape. And the final one, opening up land and relaxing licensing conditions. Very quick example from Indonesia here, where there has been a few pieces of legislation that have rebalanced tax rates that coal mining companies pay to the state if they invest in downstream infrastructure, down to 0% in some instances. The legislation extends mining permits without them being offered back to the state. And importantly, the legislation was introduced with very little public participation. It's been heavily criticized by civil society groups, by a wide range of groups in Indonesia, and a sense there that the COVID-19 conditions were capitalized on to bring this legislation through. So they're the three themes, Nicole, that speak most directly to economic pressures, but really all of the 7 themes kind of intersect and work together.
Thanks, Tim. And so you can get a sense for the the people who've joined us, you can get a sense of the depth of information that's in the report. So really do encourage you when you have the chance to have a look at it, because it's got that breadth of perspectives and case studies across it as well, which I think really strengthens it. One of the other areas, and I said we're looking at sort of some issues that cut across multiple themes, and in fact, AJ's asked a question about this in the chat as well, conveniently, is about the additional demands that have been placed on governments and regulators during this time, but not only on governments and regulators, actually, also demands on companies and demands on civil society and communities. It's a theme, again, that cuts across, or an issue that cuts across multiple themes. So can you talk, Tim, a bit about those themes and then the risks that creates in relation to corruption and how it plays out?
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks for the question as well, AJ. An example from Mexico brings a few of the themes together that talk to these additional demands. They are stretched oversight and pandemic distraction, shrinking civic space, digital engagement contested, and corporate giving, corporate philanthropy, and lobbying during pandemic times. Mexico is a really interesting case. On the one hand, mining has been prioritized. There was a suspension of mining early on in the pandemic, but it was then prioritized. The funding of the regulator has been cut by about 30%, which was a pre-existing austerity measure, but likely compounded during the pandemic. And the judicial appeal process has also been disrupted, suspended in many cases. So the rights to appeal, access to justice for mining communities to appeal mining licensing and permitting decisions have been very limited. And there's cases of mining communities having to wait significant amounts of time to have their cases heard against mining approvals. So there's a picture of a demand on the regulator as resources diminish, a demand to still prioritize mining activities. At the same time, and this is a very strong theme, thanks to Laura, with the interviews that came through from CSOs and mining communities themselves, they feel like their access to the state has been limited in the pandemic, with restrictions to gathering that have impacted communities' own ability to meet themselves, to make decisions, to contact the state. Their voice, they say, has been restricted in the pandemic. And an interesting observation out of all of that it's kind of a double impact, where there's a sense of a mining exceptionalism, where mining companies have this prioritized access to the state at a time when communities do not, which speaks in part to the pandemic distraction and stretched oversight theme, where there's a risk of government budgets and capacities being stretched, particularly over the medium to long term, as the economic impact of the pandemic might hit. It speaks to shrinking civic space. Of course, civic space has been shrinking before the pandemic, but lockdowns, restrictions in movement have all further restricted civic space. They may be proportionate, they may be needed, but regardless of the justification, they still limit the ability of citizens of mining communities to protest, to meet. They restrict public consultation. An interesting quick example here comes from Canada. Thanks, Rob, for this one. And this one surprised me a little bit, although maybe I shouldn't have been surprised. And that is digital engagement was thought in Canada to have a lot of positives, certainly some negatives, and we're all familiar with both sides of it. But positives were seen to be bringing in a larger set of government stakeholders who could be on the call more easily, bringing in people who may not have traveled to a meeting but can dial in. So the potential to bring in more people to a call was one. Perhaps encouraging youth or younger people to participate in calls. Of course, there's a shadow, there's a downside to digital participation and engagement that we're also very familiar with. There's a real risk of digital exclusion, people who don't have access to the internet, which can be whole communities in some countries may not have reliable internet. Unpacking complex information in an EIA, for instance, on a Zoom call, may not be particularly conducive. So at the same time, there's clearly significant downsides of digital engagement as well, including relationships being more difficult to build, to foster over a call on the internet. So there's two of the themes, Nicole, that speak to increased pressures, but also how governments, companies, and civil society are adapting and responding. And that's very important, of course. We're not passive pandemic condition takers in all of this. There's been a lot of adaptive and effective responses to the pandemic, and we try to highlight some of those in the report as well.
So maybe, and we do have a couple of questions in the chat that we'll come to, but I'm interested just to see, of all the issues that we've been talking about in the trends, which ones people are interested in the most. So I'm just sharing a poll for people. So these are basically the things that come up in the report. And I'm interested, or the trends as we've called them, I'm interested just to know from the people participating on this call, which ones of these is of most interest to you? Oh, we're pretty even. We're really evenly spread at the moment. It's kind of one or two people across all of them. Well, there we go. So there you go, Tim. If I took from this, it's a pretty good spread of issues that people are interested in. Spread across those. There is one more person on opening up land and relaxing licensing conditions than the others, but otherwise pretty evenly spread. Yeah, just to see that. So there you go.
I can't pick a favorite personally, Nicole. They're all my favorites. But I think it speaks to the fact that this is a complex system. Systems theory is instructional here. It's a complex system. It's difficult to predict. It unfolds in different ways in different countries, in different jurisdictions. And we make this argument in the report. It's kind of the new job of governments, of companies, of civil society to adapt to this complex system of pandemic conditions. It might be here to stay for a while. It might even be an era. And so it makes sense to build governance systems, ESG standards that are pandemic resilient.
And there's a question in the chat, Tim, that specifically relates to one of the trends, which is trend 6, giving and receiving corporate philanthropy and lobbying in pandemic times. And the question really is about whether the philanthropy of companies, it's a question from Jamie, whether that constitutes buying favour, or is it whitewashing of reputations? Are there any indications of mining companies making the donations but not seeking to maximise their profile? Do you want to talk a bit about that,
Great
question and trend?
Thanks, Jamie. And we acknowledge the report that Mining Watch Canada was involved with early on in the pandemic, which had some very interesting analysis on this particular issue. We looked at this from a lobbying perspective. First of all, there's lots of interesting potential contradictions of corporate giving and operations in the pandemic. And you and your team and network have unpacked some of those around power relations, for instance. Most times we found when there was an instance of corporate giving, it also came with lobbying. Now, of course, mining companies should act responsibly and many of them are in terms of supporting communities and countries where they can. And a lot of the direct and in-kind giving that has taken place has been very well received and much needed by mining communities. And so none of this is to say that mining companies shouldn't be supporting the response. However, from a corruption risk perspective, there are a few things to concentrate on. One is whether the giving, as you're alluding to, creates the risk of a reciprocity or a situation of state capture or undue influence in a regulatory process or a specific mining approval. And that's a risk. It's not to say it will always happen. And another area to focus on is disclosure of funds given. And we've seen this not only in the mining sector, but COVID funds in general. It's very important, of course, to make sure that the giver of the funds discloses what is given and the receiver of the funds also discloses what is given, and preferably how funds are spent. And that's not always happening. And so we heard from mining companies, some of whom who put a lot of effort into this area, business integrity systems that act to safeguard and these funds as they're given out. But there's a risk there, and not all mining companies will have advanced business integrity systems. So short answer is yes, there is an increased risk, we feel, based on what we heard in the interviews and the desktop research of state capture, of misappropriation of pandemic times funds that are given. But, you know, these are just the kind of normal risks that need to be managed in many ways, even in non-pandemic times. So it's not to say that mining companies could be damned if they do and damned if they don't here. And we've got to be careful to acknowledge when business integrity systems are strong and to encourage those kinds of standards as standard across the sector.
So we have another question, but before we come to that, I do just want to flag two other things that the report does. One is it gives specific recommendations in relation to, or questions rather, in relation to environmental, social and governance performance. So it's focused on corruption. There are questions about corruption risks in licensing and permitting, but then also questions about broader ESG performance, knowing the significant focus on ESG, particularly in the mining sector at the moment. Tim, just briefly, do you want to flag anything in particular in relation to ESG performance and some of the questions and issues that came up?
Yeah, ESG cuts through all of the themes. They're all not just about corruption risk, but ESG performance more generally. And there's kind of three cross-cutting areas here: relationships, exclusions, and legacies. One of the themes is disconnected and mediated social relations. And we might sort of discount this because we're all almost used to not being able to connect in the way that we used to. But there are real risks, medium to long term, of not being able to meet in person. People told us that it's more difficult to develop relationships. We know that through our own experience, new relationships. So if we have an existing relationship and trust with a stakeholder or a person, then, you know, that might carry us through. But what are the long-term implications of digital engagement? Real question there, in relationships specifically. Another ESG risk here is the GETSI, gender equity, disability and social inclusion, or social inclusions and exclusions. And a question is, across all of these themes, what are the social inclusions and what are the social exclusions that are created? As, for instance, mining deals are fast-tracked, do we have enough time to do appropriate consultation, especially for those groups who may not be included under normal circumstances? So that's a real question, and that cuts across all of the different themes. What exclusions are being created through this changed landscape. And then the final one here is mining legacies. We're all very familiar with the types of mining legacies that can be created for peoples, for ecologies, for economies, when mining isn't done to the standards that we would expect as a minimum. And so a question is, are we creating different kinds of mining legacies under pandemic conditions as governments become potentially more desperate to do deals to support the economic recovery, which is very much needed, of course? Are we doing deals with mining companies who may have a poorer ESG performance? Are we going after ore bodies that are more marginal, and there's less money to do environmental management, environmental stewardship, and proper social investments? These are really significant questions, and I think we'll be thinking about these questions for a good few years to come.
And the other one, again, we've got some more questions, but the other one that I just want to really make sure, of course, the focus on the report and the focus of our work is on corruption risks in this approvals and licensing process. So at the back of the paper, you do bring together strategies for mineral governance under pandemic conditions, and you're looking at a number of the issues you've just been talking about. But do you want to just say a few words about the key strategies or levers for managing the corruption risks that you've seen across the research of the report?
Thanks, Nicole. There's 71 actually, 71 strategies, but happily they're grouped over 5 kind of summary strategies, and they are: invest in relationships and networks for mineral stewardship, develop pandemic sensitive governance and ESG standards and practice, including in the mining licensing and permitting process, adapt and strengthen transparency and accountability practices to suit pandemic conditions, foster meaningful participation and socially inclusive practices for pandemic conditions, and strengthen capacity for mineral governance during pandemic times. And just so they're kind of broad catch-all strategies, we unpack those across governments, companies, and civil societies, just to give you a very quick flavor of some of the more specific recommendations for governments. For instance, disclose fast-tracked mining deals, and where needed, enhance disclosure through digital platforms. Let's not forget about disclosure as we're approving or fast-tracking mining licenses under pandemic conditions. And let's utilize digital platforms, of which many countries already do. If licensing and permitting is taking place under pandemic conditions, consider what measures are appropriate to ensure meaningful participation and to avoid exclusions. Why is meaningful participation important from a corruption risk perspective? Well, of course, doing deals behind closed doors is never a good idea for anti-corruption. Having broader-based participation in spaces that are accessible for a broad range of actors helps to reduce corruption risk. Another one for government, if needed, put on extra staff for fast tracking. We're hearing stories that regulators are stretched with mining reviews and approvals. Extra staff may be required, and maybe there's something around funding models for those extra staff for fast track assessments. Consider funding models for regulators that maintain base levels of funding. And there's different ways to go about that, but eroding the capacity of the regulator is not going to help long-term ESG performance or corruption risk. So there's a few for governments, a couple for companies, and there's more for civil society as well. Companies develop anti-bribery and whistleblowing policies and procedures suitable for pandemic conditions. Report on COVID-19 pandemic response funds given to stakeholders, and develop minimum standards for consultation for engagement during pandemic times that don't increase corruption risk or compromise ESG standards. And all of this stuff, some of it's not easy. Thinking about consultation that's effective in pandemic times, for instance. But again, it seems like, as you flagged at the start, Nicole, we're in an era, as we make the argument in the report. Even COVID-19 itself is starting to feel like an era of our times. And when you consider, as many have, the zoonotic disease drivers, which and are showing no signs of abatement, ecology, conversion, urbanization, travel, increased meat eating, it may be a good idea to think about pandemic resilience as more of a mainstreamed kind of way that we build mineral governance and anti-corruption systems.
On an ongoing basis.
Indeed.
So we have a question actually related, Tim, to one of the points you were just making from the Swedish Environmental Protection Authority. Someone is up very late, but thank you very much for joining. And it actually is a question specifically in relation to ensuring transparency effectively in relation, well, as it's phrased here, to bottom-up complementary scrutiny, because top-down transparency seems insufficient. So do you see opportunities for citizen sensing where communities are doing their own environmental monitoring, which may also increase whistleblowing? And I know in the report you do talk about increased whistleblowing during these times being seen. Do you want to say a bit about that?
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks for the great question. It's a really important way that monitoring can still take place during the pandemic. One issue, of course, is that regulators cannot travel to mining sites in many countries, or at least there's been significant disruption. So the question becomes, how do we get that data? It could be photographic evidence. It could be monitoring of air or noise, and participative monitoring is an important way that can still take place. And so there is an opportunity here. We actually don't mention this specifically, so thanks for bringing it up. It's a great suggestion for linking participant monitoring to regulators perhaps, and to mining companies as well. And that happens in some mining companies, as does social monitoring. And so in some mining companies, including one that I'm very familiar with in Papua New Guinea at the Lihir Gold Mine, there is a network of community village information officers. And their job is to report on issues that are in the village that might be related to mining impacts, and to feed those issues back during the pandemic, because it may not be possible for the whole community to meet with the mining company. And so while there are risks of that approach, it does provide a way for continuity of social monitoring during pandemic conditions. So these are the kinds of ideas for adapting practices, ESG and anti-corruption practices for pandemic conditions. Thanks for the suggestion.
And it's worth me mentioning here, actually, the work of some of my colleagues in different countries through the Transparency International Accountable Mining Program. So, for instance, in Zambia, my colleagues there have set up transparency action groups, which are community-focused groups working explicitly within mining areas to engage with companies and monitor risks and issues, and really be able to monitor transparency and accountability related issues. And that's been true across a number of countries within our program. There was also a question, Tim, here from Laura, and we've just got a few more minutes in relation to data, which sort of links to what you were just talking about, whether there's anything more you wanted to say about the impact of the pandemic on the collection, updating and monitoring of credible data for use in oversight. And I know, again, in the report, you mentioned that perhaps there's an increased reliance on existing data rather than gathering new data.
And in the EIA process, Laura, thanks for the question. There has been moves in some countries to allow secondary data to be used in an EIA process when primary data cannot and should not be collected under pandemic conditions. And so that's one way that data comes into it. The currency of data if we're using secondary data that's not collected specifically for the purposes that it's meant. Another aspect here of data, of course, is the potential to digitalize and disclose publicly mining licensing data. And so some governments, of course, already have well advanced digital systems for workflows involved in mining approvals. Some don't. And so paper systems obviously don't work very well during pandemic conditions when people aren't in the office. And so there's a real need for governments who don't have an effective digital system for mining licensing and permitting, and of course other aspects of the regulatory system. I think it's a bit of a wake-up call for those who are still using paper-based systems. And so in Mexico, interestingly, one perspective is that digital provides less opportunity for corruption because there's not the face-to-face meeting, sometimes behind closed doors with suggestive kinds of conversations. Everything's out in the open. And so certainly digitalization provides that opportunity, although it's not a panacea.
Thanks, Tim. So I think we've covered off on most of the questions that we've gotten. We've put the link in the chat to the report. So I really encourage you to read it. You've heard there's a lot in it, 71 recommendations. We don't do things by halves in the program, and Tim didn't either. But it's quite compelling reading, and it's organised under those different themes with the infographic that you've been seeing throughout. So really encourage you to do that dive into the report and to have a look and to share it as broadly as you can. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's based on actual original research and interviews done with over 80 stakeholders across different sectors, across different countries. Again, thanking our colleagues who have joined us on this call who've done some of that research for us in country so that we've got that original perspective to bring, and recognising the amount of work that's gone into the report, Tim. Thanks for doing that. We're really pleased to be able to launch it today and to put it out there, and really welcome further conversations. So if people want to engage with us, please do get in touch.